I'm reading this email, Brad, and literally tears are falling down my face because what are the odds that this lady is going through a tough time and she decides, as she's going through this tough time, she needs to hear my voice? And what are the odds that this podcast host tells me about a book she wants to send me, and it's a book that is tied to this woman's father and the brand that he was wearing? And it was the way she ended the email is this is what she needed to know, that life was going to be okay.
So very excited to have a returning guest on. Welcome, Jude.
Brad, thank you for having me back on. It's really looking forward to it. We had a great conversation on episode 237, and looking forward to coming back and going deeper into what we started a few episodes ago.
Yeah, and you're no stranger to podcast, video. I mean, all that you mentioned, with everything you've done for so many people, including Luann. I know you've been a huge proponent of her brand, and this episode is going to be a little unique because you're going to flip the script on me, and we're going to work a little bit on branding for myself and AFT this year in 2025 with Jude Charles and his team. So pretty excited about it.
Yeah. So to provide context and backstory, like Brad and I, we first met at Luann Live 2023, and of course, I've come on the podcast. We've been talking on and off just about what does it look like to even do video storytelling, like to do a docuseries, which is what I specialize in. What does that even mean? What does that look like? How do I use it? And normally what I go through with my clients is what I call a road mapping strategy session. So in road mapping, that's where we figure out, okay, what are your goals? What is it that you want to do in your business? And then how do we get you to that point? And we use video storytelling to get you to that point. And so I thought it would be fun to definitely flip the script and do this a portion of road mapping live, because normally road mapping is about 3 to 4 hours. We'll only do this for about an hour, but I want to start with, because this is the top of the year as we record this, January 2025. I'm sure you've had time to think about what last year was like and things that you were able to do, not just in AFT, but with Contractor Coalition Summit, with the podcast itself. You're at almost 300 episodes, 5 years running on the podcast. Like the YouTube page is at, I think, almost 7,400 subscribers. You're doing all these things. When you go back and think about, okay, the next steps, what does the future look like for you? What does that look like for you?
It's a really good question, Jude. And we've spent a lot of time diversifying, kind of building the product, the portfolio, if you will, and really that branding as far as kind of who we represent at AFT, the quality we put out there, the site cleanliness, the company culture. I think a lot of people have been able to see that that's really what we focus on, are like people and especially our clients. I mean, we want to invest in them. We want our clients to feel that we're a great liaison, that we really care about their project and communication, and trying to be ahead of the game with technology and QR codes. And, I touch on site cleanliness a lot. It's a comment we get very often where a lot of people are like, do you edit your drone shots, because, the sites are clean. But the reality is it's definitely a major focus because, it's really at the core of who we are. It's one of our core values. And so, for the last, starting AFT in March of 2013, here we are coming up on our 12-year anniversary this March. And, for many of those years, you're kind of pushing to get maybe in the same ballpark as some of like the other builders that have been building in Scottsdale for a long time, that have had a, long reputation here, many years in business. And now we've kind of inched our way to be competing with them, for some of these signature projects. And so, as I look at the brand now, it's definitely refining it more to that luxury clientele that we're working on. And really what that comes down to is it's not so much a dollar value that we're, call it, obsessed with. It's more that value proposition, right? And what I mean by that is that our projects range in scope and size and cost. I mean, just on a ratio for those listening, we have some projects that are 10x, our large ones are 10x of our small ones, just in dollar value. So it's not like we're trying to build the most expensive homes, but the reality is really work for the client that understands the value we bring, right? And there is a value in communication and organization. And again, we're not perfect by any means, and so we're striving to be better, but it's really aligning ourselves with those clients that understand the value that we bring here at AFT.
You mentioned refining the level of clients you work with and level of projects you work on. I know one of your biggest projects last year was Project Blow Your Mind.
Mm-hmm.
What was it about that project that was so different than other projects that you've done, and not just in scope, but in, as if I remember correctly, Project Blow Your Mind was almost a dream project for you from what you envisioned when you started AFT, right? So
Yeah,
what was that project like? Well, why was that project so different than all the other ones you've ever done?
well, I think there's a few layers to that question. I mean, it definitely, when that project started, it ended up turning in, like, the final product that people see is definitely not how it started. And what I mean by that is that the scope increased due to circumstances and opportunities for the client, with the design team. The scope escalated to what it was. And so it definitely, I think many of us builders, when you start out on this crusade of construction, it's really low barrier to entry. um, Arizona is a little different because we do have to be licensed, I have a KB1 license, which means I can do industrial and commercial and residential. And there's a lot of qualification. Fortunately, previously in my career, I had that qualification. But, California, Arizona, there's some of these states require this experience to get to a certain level of, call it, cost of project. Whereas some markets don't have any. I mean, the permitting process in some areas of the country, people are like, I get a permit in 1 week. For me, it's like 6 months. I mean, and so yes, but the point being is that the barrier to entry is pretty low. A lot of people have worked either in the trades or they've worked for another GC and they're like, I want to go off on my own. And no one's really teaching you business. That's, you mentioned the Coalition Summit, why we started that, because no one's teaching you how to contract somebody, how to communicate with an owner, as these projects continue to escalate in cost and what the risk is associated, and to make sure that you're protecting yourself, because really as a builder we're mitigating risk in all levels. And so the point being is that yes, all of us have this dream to get from the kitchen remodel, the powder bath edition, the deck edition that I did early on in my career, to like doing this project like Project Blow Your Mind. And, there's a lot of avenues to get there. There's a lot of relationships that are built. There's a lot of, hard work for sure, a lot of branding. I mean, all these things kind of play hand in hand. And so to answer that, yeah, I mean, for me as a signature project, you're doing something that in some cases a lot of people have never done before. Building a wiffle ball field modeled after Wrigley Field, doing a trampoline barn with the skate park. I mean, the lazy river. So working with some of the top consultants and experts, and needless to say that there were still some mistakes we made in that. Looking back, there's definitely different trade partners we would have associated with that, ended up hurting us because they weren't at a level to be as sophisticated to perform on this scale. So there's a lot that we can look at introspectively, but at the same time, I mean, we're really grateful for the experience and opportunity we had with it.
You mentioned there were mistakes that were made on the project. It's definitely one of your biggest projects that challenged the boundaries of even how you create. How did it challenge you as a leader? And I'm asking this question specifically because leadership is important to you. You've mentioned wanting to elevate the industry. You've mentioned not just on systems and processes, but just like the human being as well. Like in our private conversations, you've mentioned that, and like the person is important, right? The person that the employees that you're mentoring is important to you. How did working on that project challenge you leadership wise?
It's a really good question, Jude. And as you were asking that, I was thinking to a specific example. Truth be told, I mean, our delivery date for client move-in, as you can imagine, changed a few times on that project. A lot of circumstances involved with that. I mean, we definitely had a play in that, a role in that, of not hitting the closing date that should have hit. In addition, there were a lot of other factors. And there came a point in the project, and I'll just kind of preface this way. When I'm managing, I've being out of college for 20 years, working with trade partners, I've seen different ways that they handle problems or crisis. I've dealt where the trade partner has lied to me over and over about either they didn't order the material or there were mistakes on their end, and they just kind of blame everyone else or they hide behind it, and they really don't take accountability, for their mistakes. I've dealt with it where some of the trade partners call me and just openly like, hey, Brad, I messed up. I effed up. Like, we blew it. And then it's like, okay, let's game plan together. Let's figure out a solution. And I've thought about that a lot because I think as builders, at least me, I'm very prideful, just being open in some ways. I don't think in all ways, but definitely when it comes to performance or brand or timeline, it's really easy to get defensive and blame everybody else, right? That why we're not hitting our date. And we tend to do that as builders. And I thought about that because I had a client wanted to meet about, we knew that they had a large family function planned, and we were not going to hit that date to make this big event for their family. And then we were honestly just being open here, Jude. It was a 3-month delta here. That, this is March and we're like moving this closing date to June. And the client I knew wasn't happy. They kind of had an idea of why we were meeting, and we just met internally, the team working on the project, AFT and the clients. And it would have been easy for me to come into this meeting, and there were some legitimate changes from the client. There were some legitimate failures of our trade partner base. There were some legitimate scope things, but at the same time, we had, call it, some leadership challenges, whether we had not overseen the project as we should, or not encountered certain things, not managed it properly, not set proper expectations. I think in a project of this scale, like, it gets very blended, right? There's a lot of fault all the way around. And I remember going into this meeting just saying, at the end of the day, the best experience I've had is when, this trade partner comes in and says, it's our fault. We've made a mistake and we want to make this right. And that's the tone. The client came in ready to battle, and they're not really about, kind of a battle mentality. I mean, they're amazing clients. I mean, they're the best clients you could ever ask for, but they were frustrated. I mean, this has been ongoing. They were
How long was this
frustrated.
project?
I mean, this is a 5-year project. I mean, it's 2 years of almost 2.5 years to design, over 2.5 years to build. So, I mean, keeping a relationship somewhat healthy for 5 years is not an easy task. And so you're into this 5 years now. Now you're sitting down with the client saying, hey, we got 90 days still. And so coming to this meeting, I just openly sat there in front of my team and, started the meeting. And you can tell, I said, they were probably ready to address some things that were of heavy concern to them. And I just openly said, it's our fault. It's our mistake. We miscalculated, and took the 100% of the blame. I never brought up any other change orders or, members of maybe, the other team that were involved, their trade partners, supplier. I mean, there are a lot of layers to this build, as you can imagine. And we just took the stance that not only is it our fault, but we're going to take care of, living expenses for 90 days. You had flights planned for your daughter and her friends. We're going to cover the cost of those. There's an issue here. So we just full on said, we're going to cover the cost of all these inconveniences, and we're going to make it right. Because at the end of the day, like, I've always been taught and speak about it, generosity precedes prosperity. And it's not that, generosity, I think doing the right thing and just making sure the client is taken care of and knows that you're committed. So long story short, that was 10 minutes of me conversing with them about us taking the full 100% responsibility and what we're going to do to make it right. And they even made the comment. They said, we had other things we're going to address. We're not going to. Like, we're going to let it be. We trust you. It's fine. And, they weren't happy about it, but, at the end of the day, but they're like, we can live with that. We have a timeline. Let's get this timeline in June and let's get in. And so, I learned a lot that, a lot of us, whether it's pride or we don't want to let people down or we want to cover up our mistakes, it's ego that we can get in these contentious battles, even if it's not our fault. But sometimes just kind of swallowing that and taking it, it just made a healthier transition, to close that one out.
You said generosity precedes prosperity. Was that the term that you
Yeah,
used?
that's the quote. There was a mentor of mine early in my career, and to give some background, his name was Martin Iono. And so early in my career, so when I graduated from college, the one experience I had was I did production homes for a year. Now, the benefit of doing production, anyone that's worked in production, I mean, I was managing probably 15 homes, and it's a lot, but it's production, it's not high-end luxury. I mean, clients are going in, they're picking ABC, everything's scheduled. Like I'm not really having to build a schedule. It's mostly just management. So the benefit is for me is I learned like management. I learned how to communicate with trades. I learned to make sure that they're keeping schedule. You're learning somewhat quality to some extent, at a small scale. Um, but the reason I bring it up is I was at a subdivision where it was very competitive. There were 15 superintendents. Every superintendent has 15 homes, right? We're all managing for the same subcontractor base. And we had like 3 or 4 sales agents. And we would have our weekly meetings between the superintendents, us, and the 3 or 4 sales agents. And what they would do is the sales agents were responsible to bring breakfast every Wednesday to the production meeting. And so I won't call out who the other 3 were, but they would come in with, 30 egg McMuffins from like McDonald's or something and some cold hash browns and whatever. Martin would come in and he would bring this huge spread at the time as Paradise Bakery, which was bought out. But he would have these like yogurt parfaits and quiches and like this amazing stuff. Just like, hey, I really appreciate you guys. And I remember being like, college debt, young kid, married kids. And on my birthday, he gives me a handshake with $100 bill. And it was like, just to me, it was like so meaningful. He didn't have to do that, but he was always just like, I'm going to take care of everybody because at the end, if I take care of all my supers, they're going to pull for me. They're going to do better for my clients. And so he always had the best ratings for sales. And he always had the best customer service scores. And why is that? Because us builders knew that like he always did just little small things. And he always said, Brad, generosity precedes prosperity. And as you think about branding, I've never lost the point that, look, I've been open. I think I did a panel with Luann out at High Point. And I even said this, it's different for me as a builder, but it took me years to make money, where years in a business, I'm like, can I make money as a builder? But the point being is I was always kind of doubling down that maybe some projects, I was always trying to do the right thing for the client and cover things just to like build that reputation and keep that, knowing that I could double down and being generous, whether it's my team and less turnover by taking care of them, whether it's, things that Martin told me, whether it's a customer, like this example on Project Blow Your Mind. I think that by always doing the right thing financially, like, and being generous in all ways, whether you're putting good karma out in the world, it always comes back to pay you back at some point down the road.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you have this saying, generosity precedes prosperity. And you provide the context behind it, right? And we talked about this on the last podcast, where there's a difference between statements and stories. Statement, we all can say like we have integrity in our business, right? But then there is the story that comes with that, which is, tell me about a time that you lost $100,000 by doing the right thing. You have this phrase, generosity precedes prosperity. And then you backed it up with a story of how you, in one of your biggest projects, you led with generosity. The one thing I love about you, Brad, is that you're a wealth of knowledge. You've built an amazing company over the last 10 years, last decade, over 30 employees. And there's so much knowledge in you that needs to be brought out. And I say that because oftentimes as we're growing our business, as we're thinking about, okay, what comes next, as we think about how do I reach this client that I dream of reaching in a way that goes beyond the thing that I do. The thing that you do is you build homes, and that's amazing. You've done a great job at that, but there's so much more to you that sometimes clients don't get to see because you're not sure if it's even worth sharing. And I know people listening to this are probably thinking the same thing. It's like, is it worth sharing like the mistakes that we've actually made, pulling back the curtain to think about this is how we handled a situation that wasn't necessarily our fault, wasn't necessarily even the client's fault. It's just it happened because these kind of things happen. Have you debriefed the project Blow Your Mind? Like just for yourself, and like really thought through what the last 5 years were on working on that project?
Yeah, and that's a good question. The debrief is something we've started, especially the last year. And truth be told, I mean, Luann's big about that, and I know you've helped her broadcast that message about her autopsy and stuff. And so that debriefing is something we do now with everyone, and it even goes down to the level of when we sit there with our team, my builder 20 was just asked me about this recently. And I'm like, yeah, we sit down with our whole company and we'll go through what the original budget was, what the final budget was. What's that percentage difference? Why is that? Is that stuff we missed? Is it stuff we missed bid? Is it escalation in pricing, or is it change orders from the client? How did we get to there? What trades performed? What trades did not perform? Which ones should our estimators be aware maybe not to bid with again? Where did we fail as a leadership team? Where did we fail in scheduling? What did we miss? What were some of the unforeseen costs? And so that debriefing is huge, and it's really helped me evaluate maybe at a quicker scale than I would have otherwise. Because so many times in construction, it's the next chase, it's the hunt and kill, right? The next job and the next job, and you're always, and you don't go back and really look at, hey, where are the pitfalls that we had, so they won't keep recreating that same problem. And just before our podcast today, I have a client we just finished, and a great client, an amazing home, and she's like, she's very communicative. She's like, Brad, would you like a debriefing on my perspective? And I'm like, of course I would. So I said, do you want to set up a Zoom call later this week or a phone call or have me come by? And she said, let me send you an email, digest it, and then we'll meet. And I'm like, that sounds great. So I think it's advantageous to still meet with the client, even if it's positive or negative, just to understand their perspective as well.
Yeah. And I asked you about debriefing because what ends up happening is in the debrief, we definitely find the mistakes we made, things that we could do better, but we also find ways to communicate to the client how this can be done better. And I'll give you an example of that. So I've been doing video production for 18 years, producing specifically docuseries for entrepreneurs. And something I took for granted is that not everyone is ready to film when you think they're ready to film. And so like Luann and I have talked about that, where, this was in the beginning kind of intimidating for her, but then there's these 30 seconds that right before she gets on camera, I go to mic her. I go to put a microphone on her. It's a very tiny microphone. I have to put it down her shirt. It's a little invasive, right? But yet she said those 30 to 60 seconds is what disarms her. Well, I had a project I worked on in July of 2024 where I went to go film with a design and build company. So the husband he's a contractor, the wife does design. And when I got to the shoot, on the first day of the shoot is when I do the interviews. That sets the context for what we do next. That sets the information that I captured through B-roll and all these other things. Well, I noticed the husband was nervous. And, I'm not thinking anything of it. That's just natural nerves people have. But then the wife tells me, yeah, no, he's really nervous. He couldn't sleep last night. He stayed up all night and he's been concerned about doing this interview. And so I'm like, okay, I can't put this guy in front of a camera because I know if I put him in front of a camera, it's not going to come out looking right. So instead, I told him, hey, I'm going to do your wife's interview, but why don't you take me to 3 of your projects that you have ongoing right now? Just talk me through some of those. We won't film yet. I just kind of want to see what you have going on. And so we did that. And then we get to lunch, and it's at lunch when he finally tells me, yeah, I've been very nervous about doing this interview. And it's because of my accent. He is from Brazil. He's been in the States for over 20 years, but he's originally born and raised in Brazil. And he's worried that the things that he say won't come out right. He won't have the perfect grammar and things like that. And I was like, I hear what you're saying, but I don't struggle to understand you. Like when you're talking to me, I'm not like, huh? What did you just say? And then we're eating, and like 5 minutes later, he lifts his head up and he's like, Jude, to be honest with you, I'm afraid of embarrassing my wife and kids. And he's like, wow, okay. I didn't see that coming. But I was like, I understand how you might think you'll look silly, you'll sound silly, but I was like, what if you're embarrassing your wife and kids by not showing up? What if your wife has all this confidence and belief in you and she's just waiting on you to have it? Well, we ended up doing the interview the next day. And he said to me, after the interview, I asked him, how did it feel? It was an hour-long interview. He was like, to be honest with you, it felt like we were still warming up. And he enjoyed it. But he was like, what you said to me at lunch the day before was the whipping that I needed to be able to do this. Right? Now, that story, because I took for granted, I realized, oh, there's something here that I need to prepare my clients for that even I need to be aware of. And so now in meetings with clients, I use that story to find out what insecurities do they have that I'm not even aware of, that they're not willing to share unless I guide them through that. We take for granted how important it is to be able to share these stories that really disarms people. When you led with, hey, it was our fault, we take full responsibility, that disarmed the client in a way that even though they had all these other issues that they felt like they wanted to address, they didn't even address it. When you consider the content that you're creating, so the podcasting that you do, YouTube videos, speaking even, I know you do quite a lot of speaking. How important is it to you to share these mistakes and to share them in a vulnerable way like you just shared? Like, to be honest, some of it was our fault. Some of it was not our fault. How important is it for you to share that?
That's a really good question, Jude. And to be honest, it's something I battle with because I think there's a fine line, and maybe it's audience related. And what I mean by that is when I'm in an intimate group, on a panel, or whether it's the IBS Biz, or whether I'm at High Point, or some of these different panels that I'll speak on. I think it's fairly easy to do it, right? When you're, call it your peers, whether it's designers, architects, builders. A coalition summit that I instruct at, for sure, very easy audience to, a lot of. I think we could spend days about mistakes all of us have made in business, but it's easy to do that in that setting. I think I'm always cautious on social media. I think there is a level for it. Podcasts, I tend to, depending on the guests and, the questions offered back to me, sometimes I'll speak about mistakes. I'm pretty open about that. So I'm not trying to pretend that we're someone we're not. And so, social media has been interesting because, I think my point being is I think there's a fine line between making yourself feel like you're not qualified for what you do, to maybe the end customer, to being vulnerable, right? And so depending on what the content is, or the problem or the mistake, I think there is a platform for that on social media, but it just depends. And so I'm more cautious, but I'm definitely more open if it was Jude, you and I one on one, or maybe we're targeted on doing a documentary about it, or maybe I'm in a setting with my peers where I can be a little bit more vulnerable and just be like, yeah, this is, we're not perfect. There's no way. I mean, I've made so many mistakes. And when you speak about wealth of knowledge, I think like you too, Judy, you have such a good way of bringing out information out of the guest. I've been doing this podcast for 5 years every week. I haven't missed a week in 5 years. And the benefit for me is I'm meeting with every week someone such as yourself, Jude, these incredibly intelligent, guests that are, have built businesses and are entrepreneurs. And so you just kind of feed off that, and, being around successful clients, you just, over the years, you kind of, learn from your mistakes and from others' mistakes, if you will.
Your mission, and I'm going to come back to this statement I'm going to say, but your mission, both for your personal brand and your business brand, is to elevate the industry, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Do you think you're elevating the industry by holding back, though? Holding back, meaning some of the most intimate, personal things that you share is only when you're at Coalition Summit, or Contractor Coalition Summit, when you're speaking on panels, versus I know you struggle with it on social media.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a different perspective to have when you think about your mission to elevate the industry and how you go about doing that? Like, in your mind, what does that look like to elevate the industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. To dissect that a little bit, again, it's audience related. It's, the hard thing about social media is, we have a good following, on Instagram, decent one on TikTok, and, Facebook and so forth. And so a lot of our followers aren't just builders, they're not just designers and architects. I would say, even to be honest, between you and I, Jude, as you look at the analytics, I'd say a small portion of them are from the building community, a larger the general public, and people looking for inspiration, and, fans of the brand, if you will, or potential clients. And so, in the way that analytics work, if I were to post something on Instagram, a small percentage of my followers see it anyways. And how many of those are, I don't know what that reach looks like, but I will say, for those that are really vested maybe in the brand, they're listening to the podcast, they're subscribing to the podcast, they're, associated with a lot of the similar brands we're using. So at some of these functions, we're together. I have my YouTube channel. We're on the YouTube channel. There are for sure definitely more. I have more content where I'm speaking about mistakes and pitfalls and issues and things I've learned. So it's more vulnerable on that platform. So I think depending on the platform, I think in general you won't see that as much on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook as you will maybe YouTube. And to your point, the podcast or the Coalition Summit or some of these other events that I attend.
Yeah. And so what does it mean for you though to elevate the industry? What does it mean to be able to because how I understand it when you talk about it, it's usually it's to influence and change how things are being done in the industry, right? And change the approach of it. But like go deeper with that for a second.
Sure, and I think maybe I think there's a couple parts to that. Can you shape the industry by sharing mistakes? I think you can, but I think at the same time, you know, some of my most viral posts, for example, we did the QR code a couple of years ago, right? We start the QR code, and I mean, it just goes viral like so fast. And everyone's like, how did you do that? How did you do that? How can we set that up? And so now we have a lot of builders. Maybe I'll break this down one more step, Jude. Is you are very involved in the design community. We met at Luann Live in Orlando. Like you help Luann. Part of the, you know, how synced Luann and I are is because I won't do a job without a designer. And so I speak about how valuable the interior designer is to my projects, to my company, to my success, and how that's allowed me to build a brand that has separated me in a lot of ways. And so because I've been so pro designer, what that's done is now the horror stories I hear all the time from the designers of my builder is like, male chauvinistic, or they don't listen to me, or they override me, or they, all these terrible experiences. Because a lot of designers are female, not all, but I mean, regardless, sometimes there's a pushback, whether it's ego, whether they're male or female designers, to the building community, that they're going to drive costs or they're going to create more complication or extend timelines, whatever it is. And because I speak about this so much, I've seen that builders all around the country are starting to change their tune in regard to the design community. And so by elevating the community, I think there's other ways to do that besides sharing pitfalls to say, hey, here's the value of having all selections done before you start. Here's why you want a really good architectural team. Here's why you want a great designer. Here's the value of keeping the site clean. Here's why we use QR codes. People ask me, Jude, like all the time. Just yesterday, someone said, Brad, all of your supers have iPads. What is the case that they use? Because they can see them hold their case, right? What's the iPad case that you're buying in the screen protector? How are you using Bluebeam? You're big on Build a Trend. How are you using that for your business? Your Cost Plus, what software are you using? And so I think there's a lot of things that I can educate and elevate based on things we're doing to make the building process more communicative, more sophisticated, more attractive, if you will. And so I see a lot of builders working to achieve that, to grow their brand in those ways. So I think it's kind of multi-level, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. And it is. I think it is multi-level. I agree with you that it's not just the only way to share it is through pitfalls. Part of me asking that question was about going deeper with where you continue to elevate your personal brand in a way that talks about leadership. Because I think oftentimes we want to be able to help people transform. But there's a level of getting to the core of who they are, right? That helps them transform. And I think even how I started this with like Project Blow Your Mind was your dream project, biggest project you've done. And yet there were still challenges. There were still things like, yeah, I would do this differently the next time. And it's not all roses. Like people see Project Blow Your Mind and like, oh man, I would love to do something like that. But then there's that other side of it. Of course, we'll do a project like this again, but here's how we would do it differently, right?
Right.
When we go back to what's next for you with elevating the industry, what's next with YouTube, podcasts, all these things that you're doing, how do you transform to the next level for yourself? Like, what is it? Actually, I'm going to ask this in a different way. What's a story? What's a person that comes to mind when you think about, I know I want to elevate this industry. I want to change how people are doing things. Who's a person that comes to mind that has shared with you the kind of impact you've made on their life because of what you're sharing?
That's a good
And
question, Jude.
it's the one that makes you feel like, oh, this is really why I'm doing this. I'll give you context. I want you to really think about this so I'm going to give you a story about it. I was on a podcast a couple months ago called I can't remember the name of it now, but it was an Etsy podcast, and I was talking about storytelling. Of course, in 2019 I made a very conscious decision to step out of the shadows. I had been doing video production at that point for 13 years, I think, and I was like, you know what, I've been doing this a long time. Had my head down, never really sharing the information and knowledge that I have, but I'm going to get out there and speak. Well, I got out and spoke on stage in New York, group of 200 people. And long story short, people loved it. It was amazing. And that began for me like, oh, I've got to do a lot more of this. So from that point on till today, I've been on over 150 podcasts. It's a big part of my mission to lead and empower entrepreneurs to have relentless courage. Part of that I've understood in the last year alone, that execution of leading and empowering entrepreneurs to have relentless courage comes from my voice. Now, I didn't always understand that, but I got this email in November while I was working on a project. And I remember waking up the last day of this project, or actually the day after the project, and I was still in Chicago. And I got this email, and it was a very long email. I write an email newsletter, and one of the emails that I write in the very beginning that people get is me telling the story of right before my 30th birthday, how I had a crazy adventure in Colombia. And at the end of the email, I say, well, how did you spend your last birthday? And normally that gets a good response. People will respond to it. But this lady decides to respond, and it's a very long email, but it has nothing to do with her last birthday. The very first line of this email says, my father passed away a week after walking me down the aisle. And so immediately it catches my attention. And I literally sit and it's a very, very long email. And she goes on to say how her father had died in 2010. And this was the person that pretty much mentored her on running a business. Her mom ran a drapery business. Now she was taking it over. But her and her dad used to meet to talk about business and to help her understand how to take over the business. Well, her dad died in 2010. And then most recently, in November, her uncle had died, which was her father's brother. And so she felt like she was losing this connection to her father. And she said, she was feeling down. And for some reason, now I don't have a podcast, Brad, but for some reason, she said she went on the podcast app and looked up my name because she had heard me on other podcasts and she wanted a voice that sounded familiar, a calming voice. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And so she chooses to listen to one of the most recent ones I had done at that time, which is the Etsy podcast. And it has nothing to do with her business. She's in the drapery business. She doesn't have an online Etsy store, but she decides to listen to this. Well, in the very last 2 minutes of this podcast, the host asks me what books I'm reading right now. And I tell her. And then she said, there's a book I want to send you. And before I tell you the name of the book, there's one part of the email that's so important that she mentioned probably a couple weeks before her dad passed away. He started wearing this hat called Life is Good. That's what it said on the hat, Life is Good. And she didn't know why, because her dad never wore hats, but that's what he started wearing maybe a couple months before he died. And so she's listening to this podcast, and this lady says, I want to send you a book. And the book that she sends me is a book, title is Life is Good. Life is Good is a brand. And I'm reading this email, Brad, and I begin literally tears are falling down my face because what are the odds that this lady is going through a tough time and she decides as she's going through this tough time, she needs to hear my voice. Then she not only picks a podcast that has nothing to do with her business, because I've been on quite a few interior design focused podcasts. She could have chosen that. She decides to listen to an Etsy podcast. And what are the odds that this podcast host asks me about a book and then tells me about a book she wants to send me, and it's a book that is tied to this woman's father and the brand that he was wearing. And it was the way she ended the email is this is what she needed to know, that life was going to be okay. And here I am thinking that, of course, I get on podcasts and I'm sharing about storytelling, I'm sharing about video and all these other things, leadership, right? Like our last podcast. And there's so much more to it. There's so much more impact that you're making that goes beyond the thing that you do. Who's that person for you that when you think about the impact you made on that person, it wasn't even what you were expecting?
Yeah, Steph. I mean, it's emotional listening to that, Jude. I mean, your story is very heartfelt. I think that there's a few that come to mind. I think again, and maybe to tee this up a little bit, was fortunate to attend. They had like a LinkedIn global conference, back in New York, and this was pre-COVID, so 5-6 years ago. And there's a really big influencer there. She was a female. I don't remember her name to give her credit, but I know she was in the health industry in Texas. Um, and she made a comment. She said, for a long time with my brand, I would always, before I turned the camera on to do a video on LinkedIn, she's very active on LinkedIn. She would say that, I'd always make sure my hair was done and my makeup's done and I'm looking the part and everything else. And she said, what I realized is I just need to be me and not worry about, some of these little ancillary things. Like sometimes just get in front of the camera and just be personable because people relate to that. And the point being, you speak about, her father passing out there, a couple years ago, my father passed away, and 4 months later, my business mentor passed away. I lost both of them in 4 months.
Mm.
And I was actually at IBS in Orlando. I had just completed a live podcast. When I went to Orlando, I knew that my dad was sick. I mean, he was healthy his whole life, and he said his stomach hurt. He was going to get and get testing. This is all within a week. Within a week that I'm going to Orlando, and he's like, I'm sick. And so I went to the hospital with him on Friday. He went into the hospital Monday. They kept him in. That following Friday, I go visit him and my mom in the hospital, and he's like, I have liver cancer. He never drank, smoked, but and we're like, it's okay. I know some talk doctors. Like, we'll get some help, Dad. Like, I'm super confident that like we're gonna get this figured out. And so I'm like, well, Monday I'm supposed to fly to Orlando. I have these speaking engagements. I'm doing like podcasts, and my dad and mom were like, yeah, you need to go be there. So I fly out Monday. I'm talking to my dad Monday night in Orlando. And keep in mind, he's only been in the hospital for a week now. We just found out he has this, cancer. And man,
You can take your time, Brad.
yeah,
I appreciate you sharing.
yeah, I
I didn't
appreciate
know
that.
I didn't I didn't
What's
know
that?
we'd
Go
go
ahead.
this deep today. No, I was gonna say I
Yeah,
didn't know we'd go this deep today, but
I
here's
wasn't ready for this, Jude. Come on now.
but it's
But yeah,
important to the work that we do because there's a human being behind everything that we do, right? There's a human element to it. And that is the thing that I try to pull out most in everyone that I talk to. When I talk about relentless courage, it's that courage to show your human side, good or bad, right? T-
yeah,
And
oh, go ahead.
I there is why I started this with that you have a wealth of knowledge and you have all these things that are so critical to how you've been able to grow AFT over the years. In my opinion, that's the part I want to see. Not necessarily that I'm trying to make you cry because I didn't expect to go there today. I didn't think that's what we were doing at all. Um, but there are some things to you that I was like, there's more. Let's pull back the veil a little bit more, just a tiny bit more. I'm not asking to get emotional each time. I'm not asking to even be extremely vulnerable each time. But what I am saying is there's only one you. There's no one in this world like Brad Leavitt. There's no one in this world like Jude Charles. And just like you were talking about this woman who gets on LinkedIn and she's like, I just got to be me. If you are willing to be you in all the facets of what that means, a three-dimensional view of what it means to be you, there is a bond that is created with people who are willing to follow you that can't be broken. It's like a three-strand cord that cannot be broken. And so I appreciate you going this deep. I want you to finish your thought, but I did want to point that out too, that it's like when we think about our mission and purpose, there's a responsibility to truly showing up as who you are. And maybe even if you don't know who you are, not necessarily who you are, but what your mission and purpose is, there's still a responsibility to that, because that's the thing that people are the most connected to. That's the thing that is going to help others transform in a way that you're not even expecting for them to transform. But go ahead and finish your thought.
Yeah, and I'll come back to that. But what's interesting about the point you brought up, Jude, is when people see, call it the vulnerability, or you, the you're Jude, right? And for me, I've always found it valuable that, yeah, I want our clients to know that we're people, right? I want them to know that we have kids and families, and that's much bigger than just a transaction. Like, these are relationships that are much bigger than just building a home. I feel we bring a lot more to the table, and so I've always found value to know that I'm a young father. I have 6 kids, right? 5 daughters. I mean, I have 2 daughters in college. I have, my youngest is in, second grade. I mean, I'm here for the long haul. Like, I'm not going anywhere. And there's a family, there's vulnerability behind the scenes. But the point being is that, I'd remember hearing that. And as you can see, I got emotional here with you, Jude. I had just finished that live podcast, and I knew it was bad because I had about 100 messages on my phone, right? When I'd offer only 60 minutes. And the first one I see is my cousin, who I'm so close with, my cousin Eric. His dad and my dad are identical twins. And so
Oh, wow.
he, being identical twins, and we grew up just a couple miles apart, we're the same age. Like, we've been very close. I mean, you think you're like half siblings. Our fathers have the same DNA. So it's almost just different moms, right? It's like we're half siblings, even though we're cousins. And he's just like, I'm so sorry for your loss, Brad. And I'm like, what? Like, what? So I call my mom, and, bottom line is they had given my dad a couple days to live. And I had some other things. So I called all the vendors, and I'm like, I got to take an emergency flight home from Orlando to Phoenix. And, took that late flight out of Orlando and is pretty down. And I did a video in the airport that was like this, like I got very emotional, like on camera. Point being is that, shortly after that, after, this was Tuesday, I flew home Tuesday night, was there bedside with my dad Wednesday morning as soon as I got in, and he passed away Friday. So I got a couple of days with him. And it was just so fast. I wasn't ready to lose my father that fast, and we're very close. So it was really hard for me. But the point being is that, fast forward, the amount of support, and like you're saying, and specifically there were, 3 builders that had reached out and had been dealing with personal issues, and they had been following me for a long time. And the funny thing is, these ones I had never met in person, but had dealt with some similar losses, and at the same time were young fathers. And they had made a point that a few things, Brad, we really appreciate that. There's no such thing as like this work-life balance. Like, we talk about it, it doesn't exist. But running a business, 30 employees, speaking, podcasts, like 6 kids, it's hard. And so I have to be very targeted with my time. And I show that. Like, I try to be very involved, as much as I can with all of my children. And that's a priority for me, and always has been. And so they say, Brad, we see you as a dad. We see, how close you were to your dad, to vulnerability, but also they said, in following you, not only to make more time for our kids and family, which we've done the last 12 months or 2 years, but we just got our first project of $1 million. Before, the most we'd ever done was 300,000. And we felt we were prepared because of like things you had shared with us. And so having this, where it's like a business side, where they just felt ready for the next chapter because of the information they had gathered from the podcast. So like, we download every podcast, we listen to it. So from like the leadership, we have the team, we have the company culture, some of the systems from everything we've downloaded from your guests. And then the personal side, we feel like our personal life's in balance, and, the vulnerable side, to me, it's kind of like you, where you don't know people are watching. And those are 2 or 3 that I'd never met. And it just, if anything, it gives you that energy to keep going,
Yeah. Yeah. Gives you the energy to keep going. It gives you the energy to know that you're on the right track. You're doing the right things. You're sharing the right, because sometimes you don't know. This can be sometimes a one-sided conversation where it's like the podcast is going out, but then you don't know what people are taking back from it unless they come back and share. To bring this full circle, part of why we're sitting down to this podcast is because you thought about like, okay, I know I need to go deeper. I know I want to share more. I know it's time to put more emphasis on the personal brand, but how does it all make sense? When part of the reason I love video storytelling is because when you can package information in the right way, it can become leverage for you, where it becomes this asset that compounds. And it's not just, oh, it was a really cool video we did and we put it on YouTube. It's like, it's the thing that people go back and watch over and over, and it stands the test of times. I'll give you two separate examples, really quick examples. The first time I did a docuseries was in 2010 with a cosmetic entrepreneur. She was running a business, starting a business from the ground up. And we did the docuseries from 2010 to 2013, so 3 years. The last one was in part 3 was in 2013. Well, I remember going back to her page back in 2017, and she was still sharing the same docuseries that we had finished in 2013. She was still sharing, and at that time, I have a screenshot of it. I think at that time it had gotten like over 300,000 views. When she shared it 4 years later, almost 5 years later, I had it happen again recently in 2024. I had a client that I did a legacy project for. So legacy project is same thing, docuseries, but it doesn't get published. This is just for her internally. Want to be able to capture the story. This lady specifically was running $100 million business, and she had built a business over 20 years, really big business, amazing. But she didn't obviously release the docuseries. I think we finished it in 2018, maybe 2019. Well, last year, she releases it out of the blue. I didn't even know she was going to release it. Out of the blue, she releases it. What ended up happening is she ended up selling the company, and I didn't know that at the time, but she ends up selling the company. And for her, this was a milestone. She wants to finally share the story of how she built this. Well, that docuseries, it was originally a docuseries. She just put it up as one video as a documentary. Hour and a half long, maybe. Over 37,000 views on this docuseries. It was done 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And so how you put this together, how you leverage this, how does this make sense, is that all of these stories come together to create maximum impact that stands the test of time. And that allows you to leverage it to open up other opportunities, to open up other doors that you wouldn't have been able to, because people, if they're coming to you for the first time, there's over 300 episodes. Like, where do I even start? How do I know if episode 5 or 10 is even worth listening to? All those questions get answered in this docuseries because it becomes this, there's this information that's packaged up in a very dynamic way that allows you to now go deeper. And this person is, within 30 minutes, they're bought into who you are beyond the thing that you do. I had you watch a short docuseries that I did with interior designers, with a interior designer. I've been working with interior designers for the last 2 years, but there's one I had you watch recently. What did you take away from that, from this interior designer from Chicago, in watching her? Especially, now here's the real context I want to spin it on. You've never met her, I assume. You've never met her. And you are adamant about the kind of designers you work with. If you, as a builder, were to get a video like that of someone introducing themselves to you, you've never met, you have no idea what she's about, who she is, but in 6 minutes you watch this video, what do you take away from it?
You hit on the head, Jude, and this is why we're going to do this year. And I mean, just watching that video, and why others who are listening need to reach out to you, because, you know, seeing that video again, I had never met her. You know, to your point, video changes things, right? That's why a lot of us, you know, people look at celebrities and you feel like you know them, maybe because how they acted in a certain film, you relate to them or whatever. I mean, there's something about seeing them on screen that you feel like, hey, that person's real, it's tangible. I feel like I know them, right? But set that aside. What the video storytelling did in that clip you sent me, there was one part of it. She made a comment like, if, and I'm trying to remember how she said it, maybe 3 or 4 year old me could have seen that I'd be designing these projects, right? So, you know, so as a little girl picturing where I am now, you know, so there's this vulnerability of someone who's living their dreams, right? And she's trying to escalate, increase her brand to next level and do these amazing projects. And so, to your point that we've been talking about this whole time, this vulnerability, this humanity, right? The personality, their drive, their desire, what made them, whether it's their wealth of knowledge, whether it's the context they've had, whether it's the business they built. I mean, there's just so many layers, and to be able to put that on video, I think it makes people relate instantly. where they want to work with you, they want to collaborate. And so, yeah, to your point, I mean, this is something you can use in many different facets.
What's so funny about the comment you just chose to like that sticks in your brain is that happens in the first 60 seconds of this 6-minute video.
Right.
Where
Right.
she talks about it was specifically she used to design her room, rearrange her room, and her mom took a picture of her when she was young doing this. And then she's I think this is like at least 30, 40 years later, she's running an amazing interior design business. But she was like, if I could see, if I knew, if I could talk to 4-year-old me
Hmm.
and told myself that I would have an amazing business, I don't think I would believe myself, is what she said, I think. And
Right.
that vulnerability, it's not her deepest, darkest secret, right? It's not
No.
even mistakes. It's not even mistakes that she's made, but that's the thing that sticks with you. Even though that video, we go on to talk about the amazing projects she works on, or we talk about her process, different things like that. But that's what sticks with you.
Hmm.
That's that bond that is not easily broken. And you've never met her, but this is the thing that stands out with you, right? So,
Well, it's because she's living her dream. I mean, the thing is, she's like,
right,
so why not work with someone that's that passionate about what they do?
right. Without having to say, I'm passionate about what I do,
Right.
right? People are thinking about, okay, I know I need to tell stories. I know I need to do video. How does this even make sense? What should I be sharing? There's no one size fits all. There isn't like this is the exact formula and this is what you have to follow. But I do believe that you lead with your heart and you lead with being able to share with people things that you think, you know what, that may not be important. So what, share it anyway. I don't know that it's important that I tell you about a story of a lady who wrote me an email that ended up bringing me to tears, even though, to be honest, like, I mentioned how long it is and I almost didn't want to read it. And it's like, I'm thankful I read that because it brings a different level of passion as to what I do and how I do it. But I didn't know if that story was going to matter to you. I didn't know that story was going to move you in a way that, that was not the direction of where we were going today in the podcast. So I didn't know that. But again, it creates a deeper connection. And when we're trying so hard to communicate why we're different, the kind of work that we do, all these things, like if you will take the time to share the moments in life that happen to you, and then the lesson that so a story is about a very specific moment in time and the lesson that you learn in that moment in time. As long as you do those two things, tell me the moment, tell me the lesson, everything else will come together over time. It's just up to you to now share that story over and over, to package it in a video that allows you to use it not just today, January 2025, but what about January 2026? Or what about January 2030? 5 years later, when you think, oh, this is, it might not be that important, but then you realize like it's not stamped in time what we film. It's not stamped in time that this is, because the docuseries is about who you are, right? Even when you're getting on video and you're doing a Instagram video, it's about who you are, not just about the thing that you do. We can share the tips and tricks, and there's time for that, but there's also share who you really are. Pull back the veil to share the human being, and that's what will help you take it to the next level, help you to leverage. We have spent the last hour talking through this. I took you on this journey of road mapping, a very light version of road mapping that I haven't done before. But what do you take away from just everything that we talked about from the very beginning of just like where are you going to where we've kind of landed on you sharing your story in a packaged way?
Yeah, I think, as I look at this, I mean, branding is so important for all of us, right? As you think about what your brand is, and it could be, and to your point, I mean, you kind of gave some real life context that a lot of us are afraid to be on camera. I know when I was early on, I hated being on camera. Like I was super nervous. I felt super self-conscious. Like I hated my voice. Many people that hear their voice on podcast or video, they hate it. And so there's a vulnerability that's real. But as you get through that and you start to realize that, hey, there's value to people knowing who I am. The point being is that I've spent so much time in branding and speaking with marketing. One thing I've never done is really built a story. We know our story internally. We have our core values. We share them. We speak about them. We have an incredible company culture. A lot of people follow AFT. My team, they have their own Instagrams. They all say AFT Construction. Like they're totally into the brand, building their own brands, part of our parent brand. but that's not something we've ever broadcast very much, right? I maybe speak on very small levels, but we've never really built like, well, people may feel like they know me to some extent, but like what's made me me? What has made AFT what it is? What is the history there? What is, why we do what we do? Why are we so passionate? Just like you did in 60 seconds with that design out of Chicago. And so for me, having, dove through this conversation with you, Jude, it makes it very easy and clear of what next steps would be for us to say, okay, we're ready to launch 2025 in this really long, large format video of what AFT is and Brad Leavitt is, and how those are combined and intertwined together.
Yeah. Yeah. Hearing something said 1,000 times is not as powerful as seeing it once. I believe that we are in a trust recession, that there's so much noise out there. People are talking about how great they are, but can you see it? Can you provide the dramatic demonstration of proof that you're not just great at what you do, but there's this three-dimensional human being that not only they want to work with, they feel like they have to work with, because what you provide is so much more. Thank you for trusting me through this process and trusting me to flip the script on you. And I hope your audience takes that away too. I hope they take away the importance of sharing your story, how you go about doing that. I'll leave with this one thing. If you want to go deeper with this, I'm going to do this. Didn't plan on doing this, but I'm going to give away to anyone that goes to storyaudiobook.com. I'm going to give away the dramatic demonstration audiobook that goes deeper into all of this and how you can do this for yourself. I normally sell that. I believe it sells $400, but I will give it away completely free to anyone that signs up on the Brad Leavitt podcast. And go deeper with this. If anything, as you listen to this, when it comes out, if this is going to be a different year for you, make it a different year. Commit to it. Say yes to your why, to why you're doing this and how you're doing it, and truly commit to executing on that why. Again, thank you. Thank you, Brad.
Well, Jude, thank you. And for those listening, Jude and I will be in contact on this video, so stay tuned for later this year as we release our story with Jude. So appreciate you coming on and making time and interviewing me this time, Jude.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Brad.
If you get value from the show, please support us by giving a 5-star rating and review on whatever platform you listen to. And I also have a favor to ask. We've had some incredible guests that come on and share their wisdom, their knowledge about their business. So if you have friends or family members that could benefit from those episodes, please share it with them, as well as any other business owners that you're networking with that could get value from the podcast or certain episodes. Please share those as well. Again, subscribe, make sure you're following. Any questions that you have, topics. We've had listeners reach out about certain guests that we should have on the show. Again, brad.l@aftconstruction.com. Email me for topics to address, guests that we should have on, and even if you think you'd be a great guest for the show. So again, thank you for all your support, and we'll see you next time.